Hello and welcome to S&P Global Ratings Fixed Income in 15, a 15-minute chat with a market voice and an S&P executive. My name is Joe Cass and I head up market outreach in the UK. Today I'm joined by Mohamed El-Erian, President of Queen's College, Cambridge University and Chief Economic Advisor at Allianz. Alongside Mohamed is Martina Cheung, Head of ESG S&P Global and President of S&P Global Market Intelligence. Thank you very much for joining me today, Mohamed and Martina.
Thank you.
So before we start, just a very quick reminder that the views of the external guests on the show today are their views alone and they do not represent the views of S&P Global. So Mohamed, let's kick off with some questions for you. You've been involved in finance and investments for over 30 years. So in your view, what will be the lasting effect of COVID-19 on financial markets and the global economy?
So I think the most lasting and worrisome effect is that COVID has been the great unequalizer. It has worsened not just the inequality of income and wealth, but it has worsened the inequality of opportunity. That is, of course, very important for the economy. It's very important for the social fabric, and it's important for the institutional setup. So when you put these three things together, it has relevance for the markets, even though the markets have been disconnected from such fundamentals for a while.
And Mohammed, you wrote the New York Times bestseller, The Only Game in Town. So that focused on central banks, instability, and avoiding the next crisis. So, how has the role of central banks evolved over the past 5 years, and what can we expect going forward?
So I wrote that book because I was worried that continued massive reliance on central banks would lead us to what I called a T junction, a situation where we could not continue on the current path and we had a choice either to hand off policies to policymakers better able to deliver high, inclusive, or sustainable growth, or alternatively, end up in a renewed paradigm of financial instability that could undermine the economy. So when the book was written and came out in 2016, I said, within the next 5 years, we will face this dilemma, and the key issue is to try to avoid it, is to try to take steps early enough. Unfortunately, the reliance on central banks continued to be excessive. And now we come to a situation where central bank credibility is in play. That central banks face a very difficult set of policy options. The answer is still a policy handoff. The answer is still for structural reforms and for fiscal policy to be well designed and active so that the central banks can slowly exit what is an unsustainable paradigm. If you want an image, you press harder on the accelerator of structural reforms and proper fiscal policy. You slowly lift the accelerator of excessive liquidity injections, and then you press harder on the accelerator of macroprudential measures. And that's the handoff we're looking for if we are to avoid something really unpleasant.
Martina, on the topic of central banks, what role can they play in aiding the transition to a more sustainable economy?
Thanks, Joe. The objective of the central banks from a supervisory standpoint and in the interest of maintaining price stability and stability of balance sheets is very much at the core and the heart of how they're responding to sustainability. And if you were to flip it and talk about the implications of climate change, for example, we see that coming through in three areas: physical risk, so the actual cost of damage to physical assets or disruption caused by that damage. We have transition risk, which would be the including the investment needed to fund transition to net zero carbon. And finally, one that's maybe not talked about as much could be litigation risk as well that companies may face to the extent that they're making major changes in one direction or another. And so all of these things impact company performance, impact the exposure that that financial institutions have and banks have to those companies. And so this is something that really is quite pivotal for all aspects of the financial landscape. And central banks in particular have begun to play a very proactive role. So we saw the setting up of the Network for Greening the Financial System in 2017. In December of 2020, the Fed joined that, and so now we have the vast majority of central banks in the world working collaboratively, which is very important to ensure that we have some consistency in the frameworks for the financial system. And I think we'll see more specificity around the elements and the various components within a framework that would appear here. So we've seen the Fed, for example, is co-chairing the task force on climate financial risks, which will take a look at how this would be taken into consideration under a Basel agenda. So a lot of work to do there, a lot of work to come. The ECB has been very, very proactive in this area, along with others. So we would expect that to continue to grow.
So, Mohamed, in your opinion, what will be the role of sustainable finance and ESG in a post-pandemic global financial market?
Its role should be huge. And what's really encouraging, and this is one of the silver linings of COVID, as much as this has been a tragic shock and too many lives have been lost, there are also some silver linings. And one of the silver linings is that this emphasis on ESG and on a green recovery is going from just playing defense to also being seen as playing an important role in offense. So this is a window that has opened, and where these sorts of investments and this sort of finance should play a key role in making sure that we come back not just stronger, but more sustainable. And what I think is very encouraging is how the financial industry is responding. And it's the central banks, as Martina pointed out, it is the banks, the commercial banks, and it is also the non-banks, including the asset managers. And I think that is a very encouraging change.
Fantastic. So, Martina, let's discuss ESG in a bit more detail. What are the fixed income markets telling us about the growth in ESG through things like sustainable bonds or ESG in credit ratings?
Well, we're seeing a massive explosion on the sustainable bond front, and we would fully expect to see more of that in 2021. In 2020, we already saw, I think, over 60% growth in sustainable bonds year on year, and the big growth story of the year was social bonds that actually grew by a factor of about 8x last year. Obviously, the concerns around inequality as well as the implications of the pandemic contributing to that. Going forward in 2021, the expectation is that sustainable bond issuance will top about 700 billion. Two areas of note. There's a lot of dialogue going on in the market right now around transition bonds, which would be reflecting the investment that I talked about. The companies will need to make to actually either build the technologies or retrofit assets to reflect their commitments to net zero, low carbon. And another area that we're seeing more and more dialogue around is biodiversity bonds. And this is an area which is of keen interest to many European stakeholders who have been thinking about climate for a long time, and gets to the heart of the impact on natural capital, nature. We've seen the announcement of TNFD to complement TCFD, where N stands for nature. So we would expect to see a lot more innovation in that area. And specifically within the credit rating area, our S&P Global Ratings colleagues did a look back from April 2020 to December 2020. And in that timeframe, there were about 2,300 ESG actions, including, or credit rating actions rather, including upgrades, downgrades, credit watch changes, outlook changes, and those 2,300 were connected to ESG factors. Now, the vast majority of them were reflecting the sort of quote unquote social factors stemming from the pandemic and changes that companies were making. But we definitely see ESG playing a very important role in the definition of credit ratings as well.
And Martina, much of what we're seeing on the regulatory agenda is focused more on climate and less on ESG as a whole. So what are the main drivers of this, and are there benefits or any trade-offs we should consider?
Yeah, I'd be curious to get Mohamed's view on this as well. The perspective just from listening to policymakers and having ongoing dialogue is the sheer scale of the crisis and the emergency that we're facing is something that that needs a multi-policy framework, multi-regulator approach. And I mean, you see that reflected in the Biden administration's pretty comprehensive plan on climate change. The other contributing factor, I would say, in terms of climate specifically, as opposed to nature, which is coming in now, is the climate is measurable with CO2. It's a global metric that that is recognizable and measurable. But specifically within climate and the regulation there, I think there's a fair amount of acknowledgement that just the first step is getting the disclosures from companies in whatever sector that they're in. And we have, I think, around 1,800 companies globally reporting in support of TCFD. But even there, we need to see, and I think a number of observers in the market have acknowledged that there's a need for greater consistency and comparability, even for the companies that are actually reporting using the TCFD framework. And then the question is, how do you get the millions of other companies along that journey? And when it gets to smaller companies who maybe don't have the bandwidth to hire very sophisticated sustainability teams, gets into the question of proportionality. And would you be requesting smaller companies, for example, to answer the same questions or a simpler set of questions? And so I think we're just on the first step in the journey here, which is let's just get the disclosures going. And then I would expect to see some greater investment of time from regulators to help other companies join and get more comprehensive reporting across all sectors. But very curious to hear Mohamed's point of view on that as well.
Great, Mohamed. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that you wanted to share?
I would just reinforce what Martina said. We are on the initial steps, and what's encouraging is that more and more people are getting involved. So it is the public sector, it is more of the private sector, and of course it's civil society, but also that it's about disclosure, yes. It's also about explicitly bringing climate risk into scenario analyses. Banks, for example, are having to look at this in their stress test. That's really encouraging because the more you wire it in the system, the more likely you are to transition from just getting more information and doing more analysis to sustainable steps. And I think it's an encouraging move, but we've got to keep the focus on this.
So now we are going to move on to some non-market related questions. So Mohamed, I'll start with you. So I remember towards the end of your time at PIMCO, your daughter presented you with a list of 22 milestones in her life that you hadn't been able to attend due to working. So I was interested to know how that experience changed you. Did it adjust your approach to the whole work-life balance from there onwards?
It was worse than what you just said because it wasn't 22 things I had missed in her life. It was 22 things I had missed that year. So she showed me, her school year started in September, and she showed me that list in May. So the year wasn't even over when she showed me these 22 things that I had missed, from her first day of school to her first football game, soccer game. Yeah, it did change. I decided at that point that I needed to rebalance my work-life equation, if you like. I went from a very enjoyable but intense full-time job to a portfolio of part-time activities that I could control better. And that allowed me to spend a lot more time with my daughter. I mean, just taking her to school and picking her from school. And I want to stress, I was incredibly privileged to be able to do this. Not everybody can do this. And I felt incredibly privileged to do this. It wasn't an easy decision, but when I look at my relationship with my daughter today, and now it's 7 years later, I really do think that was the right decision, even though it came at some cost.
And Martina, a bit of an off-topic one for you here. If you could give your teenage self advice, what would it be?
I grew up with my parents had a business, so we all worked in the family business, so Chinese restaurant, and I always wanted to be a businesswoman. Didn't know what that meant, but just generally, kind of businessy focused. I suppose I might say take your time, because I always felt like I was sort of striving for that next thing, and maybe just take your time, take a pause, appreciate the day that's in it, and just keep working hard, and good things will come. I do want to say, Mohammed, my son is turning 2 in April, and I could only wish that he would remember that I spent a whole year working from home, and did every bath every night, but I don't think I'm going to get the benefit of that. He's going to be giving me his list of 22 at some point as well.
So, Mohammed, one for you. You've worked with and for countless influential voices in government and business throughout your career, including presidents. So, which individuals have really kind of struck you as particularly impressive or competent or insightful?
So I've been lucky to have many, many individuals that have struck me as such. President Obama is an example of an extremely analytical person who has an incredibly sharp mind and wants to understand the different aspects of a decision. My father, who encouraged me from a very young age to listen, to read newspapers across the spectrum so that I am more open to views. And of course, Bill Gross at PIMCO, one of the finest investors. And it was a real pleasure to learn from him. So I look back on my life, and I've had many people influencing me from a very early age. I think the one thing I take away is always assume the person you're interacting with is smarter than you. And even when they say something that you don't agree, instead of dismissing it, ask them why they're saying it. I have found that throughout my life, just that simple approach of assuming the person across from me is much smarter than me has ended up teaching me a lot. And that's something that the Nobel Prize winner Michael Spence always stresses. He said, don't dismiss people. Just try to understand why they're saying something that makes you feel uncomfortable.
Excellent. Martina, I understand that you're a big fan of reading. You try and read whenever you can. Are you reading anything interesting at the moment? And do you have kind of an all-time favorite book?
I usually have a few things going because I read on my phone, which is probably not best for your eyesight, but I'm about halfway through Bill Gates' new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, and a coworker just recently recommended Death: The First 5,000 Years. So I've just gotten through the first couple of chapters on that, which is quite interesting. And I'm tempted to say my all-time favorite book is The Only Game in Town, but there are a few. I'm not sure that I could pick one, but I did really enjoy that one.
So, Mohammed, I have to talk to you briefly about football, about soccer. So, I can see on your Instagram that you're a big fan of Mohamed Salah for obvious reasons. So, not many people know this, but in the 1979 to 1980 season, you were the captain of the football first team at Queen's College in Cambridge. So, can you tell me a bit about your playing career and also maybe possibly a bit about your watching career thereafter?
So first, let me thank Martina, and I have better books to suggest to you than The Only Game in Town. So I love sports, and I used to be very active before I completely tore up my knee, and part of that was the privilege to captain the soccer team when I was at Cambridge. I played 2 years in the back And then I was elected captain for my third year, and it was a real privilege. So I love sports. Unfortunately, I tend to support teams that lose consistently. So the team that I support in the UK is one that very few people will know. It's called QPR, Queen's Park Rangers. And there's no reasons to know that team because it's awful. We're always fighting relegation and we're not even in the top league. Um, but I have this loyalty. I fell in love with sports teams early and I maintained that loyalty. Having said that, when I saw Mohamed Salah join Liverpool and completely helped transform the team, he was an inspiration. And he spoke to two things that are very meaningful. One is that a catalyst can really trigger many good things or many bad things. So take seriously the notion of a catalyst. And second, he's yet another example. And my father was Egyptian. I spent the first 9 years of my life in Egypt. Take seriously the fact that when you take people and put them in the right environment, they can excel. And this is what Mohamed Salah has shown, is that in a right environment like he has found in Liverpool, he can truly excel. So the environment really matters in unleashing people's potential.
Fantastic. So Mohamed, the last question goes to you. So on Fixed Income in 15, I usually interview leaders and influential individuals across kind of finance and economics. Who would you recommend I ask to be a guest on a future episode of the show?
Wow, that is really, really hard because there's so many interesting people. I am going to give you an answer that you don't expect. I'm
Great.
gonna tell you, interview a young anchor from Bloomberg, who I think is one of the smartest out there. His name is John Farrow. He not only anchors a regular Bloomberg show, but he anchors something called The Real Yield, which are always about fixed income, because he has this incredible ability to absorb what other people are saying, simplify it, and then focus on the key issues. And I don't know how he got there because he hasn't had the traditional training, but his instinct is really good. So I would say, in addition to the great interviews you hold, except this one, Martina's great, I'm not, but in addition to these to the interviews you hold, turn it around. Go to someone who normally interviews people and ask them, okay, what they learn, because I have found him incredibly insightful in the questions he asks and the way he summarizes.
Excellent. Well, my huge amount of thanks goes to you, Mohamed, and Martina, for your time today. It's really been totally fascinating, really. So for everyone watching, thank you for viewing today, and see you next time on Fixed Income in 15.